without further ado, let me get to our contributing writer, Jake Fogleman. Jake, this week you had a piece on another poll. We referenced this last week on the podcast, but now we have the actual details of it from Quinnipiac showing a pretty big change in support for gun control. Can you give us a little bit of detail about that?
Yeah, that's right. So we previously covered a Gallup poll that showed a pretty big decline in support for stricter gun laws. Well, this new Quinnipiac poll actually shows that support for stricter gun laws is underwater, where more Americans actually oppose stricter gun laws, at least according to this poll, than do support gun laws. By 49% oppose, 46% support stricter gun laws. So that's pretty significant. That's according to the pollsters, that's the first time since 2015 they've actually seen support for stricter gun laws dip below 50%. So pretty significant development that we're seeing, back-to-back polls showing a similar trend. And this one, in fact, showing that more people oppose stricter gun laws than support them. Yeah,
no, it's interesting. Gallup showed the same drop, but they still had support for stricter gun laws as the majority position, whereas now Quinnipiac, their polling has it as the minority position. And there's also some pretty interesting demographic breakdowns in there as well, right?
Sure. So obviously the typical partisan breakdown held constant. It was 91% of Democrats, I believe, support stricter gun laws still, which is, I think, the same number Gallup found. Only 13% of Republicans. But in this Quinnipiac poll, independents, their support for stricter gun laws was down at 39%, which is, pretty low for sort of a swingy demographic in this debate. A few other interesting findings was even among young people aged 18 to 34, support for gun control was underwater amongst them as well, which is also a continuation of a trend we've seen. Earlier polling from ABC showed like a 20-point cratering, I think, in support among that same demographic. So to see that young people are also continuing to voice their displeasure with gun control is an interesting development.
Yeah, and that kind of goes against, I think, a lot of narratives that you see about younger people and their support for gun ownership. It feels like we now have a trend of younger demographics actually being more opposed to new gun restrictions. So that obviously has a lot of implications moving forward for politics around the issue down the line. Maybe not immediately, but obviously the overall change moving against stricter gun laws in the short term here in the Biden administration has a pretty big impact on how the next couple of years are going to go and whether or not the president is going to be able to institute the sorts of gun reforms that he has promised to, especially legislatively. It seems like he's probably going to be forced to act more on his own through executive branch actions than with legislation, especially given the makeup of Congress and where his polling numbers generally are at. But also, obviously, the specific polling on this issue is not trending in the direction that you would want to see if you were the president trying to pass a bunch of gun control policies.
For sure.
So it's interesting to see those younger demographics not as enthused about gun control issues. Now, I mean, obviously, polling is not perfect and not an exact science necessarily. Perhaps the sample size for the younger demographics is smaller and so might not be quite as reliable. But it's interesting nonetheless now that we have two polls showing similar results.
For sure. And it is also important to note in the polling, it wasn't all positive for gun rights advocates. It showed, I think, 62% of people said that there should be restrictions on the public carrying of firearms, for example. And it showed only a minority of people felt that more people carrying made society safer. So they did come away with a finding that, less people are in favor of stricter gun laws, but there may be a little more hesitant in terms of gun carry. Not necessarily the best question in the polls, just asking if there should be restrictions on gun owners in general carrying. There was no specifics on, may issue, shall issue, permitless, but it is important to note that there was still a majority of Americans who said they wanted restrictions on carry.
Yeah, 62%, I believe you're correct there, which is a significant amount, and obviously they only really asked two questions about guns, and neither one of them gives you a whole lot of super detailed insight into what Americans are thinking about different policies. They're sort of just giving you their general I would say, attitudes towards stricter gun laws and towards gun carry generally, because their questions they're not very profoundly worded, and the gun carry question is particularly poorly worded, in my opinion, personally, because it asks like whether or not people should. There should be restrictions on gun owners who want to carry guns in public, which is, I mean, there already are a lot of restrictions on
status quo.
It's one of these things where it's like, what exactly are you trying to get people to tell you in this question? And it's not really clear. So instead, you kind of come away more with maybe a general impression of how people feel about gun carry generally, or what that there should be some sort of restrictions on it, which is, I mean, honestly, the way the question was worded, you would expect it to more be closer to 100% agreement, because most people probably support some sort of restrictions on where you can or can't carry a gun. That's a fairly uncontroversial thing for you not to be able to carry inside of a courthouse or something along those lines, or schools. They tend to be fairly popular prohibitions on gun carry in specific areas, that especially if they provide their own security in that area, like a courthouse would, or a police station, or something of that nature. But that doesn't obviously equate to whether or not we should, for instance, whether or not the Supreme Court should strike down all may issue gun carry laws that remain in the country, or whether it should be permitless carry, or you don't get that kind of specific insight here. You just kind of get this general feeling. Right.
It would be interesting to see a more nuanced asking of that question, to see exactly where Americans fall. Like a may issue versus shall issue type of polling question, I think would be a little more illuminating than just, as you said, a general restrictions. Those exist even in states that have permitless carry. So you don't really glean much from this poll necessarily, or this question.
Yeah. I mean, obviously polling is not easy, but I do think often pollsters don't really understand the policies that they're asking questions about. And then also you have to deal with the fact that a lot of Americans probably wouldn't understand if you tried to ask them whether they prefer may issue or shall issue gun carry permitting laws.
That's a good point.
So, the job of a pollster is not easy, but oftentimes I think they run into the same sorts of issues that a lot of media run into when they're dealing with gun policy questions.